Hello and welcome to Clay to Canopy, the show where I attempt to make just about everything from the ground up. Today I will be making 3 different nut cheeses and some crackers, all for this New England Sunporch. This first cheese I'm going to make is a dill. I found this recipe on the BuddhistChef.com. I tweaked it a bit to get the dill recipe that I was happy with. I will post a link to the Buddhist Chef page in the description, but that called for more of an Italian type of herbs. There was oregano, basil, a lot of garlic, and I have altered this, keeping just the base and include dill. So here we go. I have a half a cup of soaked cashews. I have a half a cup of water. I have 3 tablespoons of nutritional yeast, a teaspoon and a half of cornstarch, 3/4 of a teaspoon of salt, a teaspoon of dill, 1 tablespoon of lemon juice. This recipe said that you could either use lemon juice or you could use cider vinegar. I pre-made this dill the other day and it turned out to be a really great cheese. It just was really heavy on the garlic, so my recipe here I'm omitting the garlic. The other thing I have is a teaspoon of maple syrup. All of these ingredients are going to go into my blender and I'm going to blend them up until I get a nice smooth creamy texture. Now I find with a lot of the store-bought nut-based cheeses, the salt content is not high enough. Cheeses are usually really salty. Since this is relying on the nutritional yeast to give you that cheese flavor, some of those cheeses just don't kick up the salt quite enough. Now I get that some people do not want high sodium. I feel like if it's not salty enough, it can't carry that good cheese flavor. I did add an extra 1/4 of a teaspoon of salt to this recipe and it worked out really well. If you're trying to cut down on the sodium, then go ahead and cut down on the salt where it needs. I'm gonna go ahead and blend this up. I went ahead and I ran my mixture twice because I wanted to make sure I had a good creamy texture. And now I just have a saucepan that I'm adding another half a cup of water and a teaspoon and a half of agar-agar powder. You want to keep an eye on this and make sure that you are whisking it, especially once it starts to pick up some heat. And I'm waiting for this to come to a boil. The Buddhist Chef online suggests you using a ramekin, but I have these very small springform pans that I absolutely love using. And I just thought it would be much easier to get the cheese out, and it worked out really well. So I have just oiled this up with a little bit of sunflower oil, and that's going to be set aside ready to go. As soon as I get a good boil, I'm going to be adding my mixture that I put into the blender into here, and we're going to let this boil until it thickens. Now, I suspect the thicker you let it boil, the harder your cheese will be and less wiggly. Make a mess everywhere as usual. What else is new? I'm just going to let this simmer here and thicken. I still want it to be pourable, but I don't want it to be ultra thin, I guess. I think I'm pretty happy with that. All right, over to my springform pan. And a tap. I'm gonna wait for this to hit room temp before I go ahead and refrigerate it, and it's gonna need 2 hours at least in the refrigerator, but I'm gonna actually leave this overnight. For the second cheese, I'm gonna go ahead and use the same base recipe I was using from Buddhist Chef, but this time I'm gonna make a sweet red wine type of cheese. So for my ingredients, a half a cup of pecans that I did soak overnight. A little bit of the skin did come off into the water, and that's perfectly fine. I also have 3 tablespoons of nutritional yeast, a teaspoon and a half of cornstarch, half a teaspoon of salt. This time I only went with a half because I do want this to be on the sweeter end. 1 tablespoon of apple cider vinegar instead of the lemon juice. And I'm also going with 1 tablespoon of maple syrup. And over here, a 1/4 of a cup of red wine and a 1/4 of a cup of water. I went with a Merlot. All right, so for processing this, it's gonna be the same thing. Just gonna throw everything into my blender and make sure that I get a good blend on the nuts, and then we're gonna go ahead and heat up the water with the agar-agar. Same amount, half a cup of water with a teaspoon and a half of the agar-agar, and it will go into my springform pan, or you can use a ramekin, whatever you have. Just make sure you oil it. And same deal, I'm gonna wait for this to come to room temp, and then it'll get refrigerated with the other cheese. This last cheese requires a 2-day process. The cheese must be fermented for at least 6 hours. Aside from adding a little bit of extra water, I did not change this recipe. And this one I got on lemon-tree.com. I will also put the link for that in the description. I did cut the recipe in half. This is a goat cheese type of cheese. I soaked my almonds, and my almonds did have a skin on them, so I had to go ahead and remove the skins of the almonds, and I'm gonna add those in. I have 1/4 teaspoon of miso, and this is the part where I'm adding extra water. It was recommending roughly 2.5 tablespoons of water, and I just don't think that's enough water to blend in my blender. And since the next step after I do that is to strain it off in a milk bag, I'll be straining off the excess water anyways. It should work. I mean, I don't see why it wouldn't work. So the instructions say to weight this down overnight and let it ferment. So that's what I'm gonna do. It is day 2. I have the goat cheese to get on with, and then I have to make some crackers. And I had originally planned on making a couple different types, but I gotta be honest with you, I am completely exhausted today. I am running on about 2 hours of sleep. Getting to that point in the project where I can feel the finish line and my body is begging for a rest, but it also makes me very restless because I'm still not finished yet. I also think that since there's a lot of flavors going on in all these different cheeses, having a simplified cracker would really bring out those flavors. I have the jam that I made in a previous video, but I also made a stone fruit jam off camera that I would like to pair with, so I'm going to be using that as well. As I attempt to test recipes out, I've gotten in the habit of shrinking down the recipe after this has fermented. I realized that it's just not enough to throw in my blender, so I'm gonna just do this up by hand. I have way too much salt, now I'm realizing, since this cheese is a very small amount. The directions online did not say how much salt. I'm just gonna go ahead and give myself a really decent pinch of salt, and I have some fresh ground pepper. I also have a 1/2 teaspoon of lemon juice. I have a tablespoon of red onion, and this is a homegrown red onion, so I want a little less than a tablespoon. My homegrown stuff is pretty potent. I just minced it as much as I possibly could. And then I have a tiny bit of some garlic. This is not even a whole clove, it's the smallest clove I could find, because my garden garlic, it has an overwhelmingly pungent flavor, so I'm using a little bit less than the recipe calls for. So I'm just gonna mix this up with my fork. I am going to ball it up and stick it in the fridge while I make the crackers, and the flavor should marry that. If I dump all of this back into this bag, I should be able to squish it into a ball. So this is gonna go into my fridge, and we're gonna move on to making some crackers next. So this is why you should not make crackers in 2 hours of sleep. I'm not gonna give you a recipe here because I have absolutely no idea how much flour I ended up adding, but I hope you enjoy the look at my struggle at cracker making. I'm starting out with a 1.5 cups of almond flour, and this is super fine almond flour. I'm going to add a 1/2 cup of almond milk, and I want my almond flour to soak in the milk. This will just make it a little bit more of a fluffy texture. I'm gonna just set this aside for a 1/2 hour. The remaining ingredients I have here are 4 tablespoons of butter, and in this case I'm using a cashew vegan butter, a tablespoon of olive oil, 2 tablespoons of rye flour. This is going to offset the almond flavor and make it feel more like a heartier cracker. I also have a 1/4 teaspoon of salt, a teaspoon of baking soda, and a teaspoon of Lakanto, which is a sugar substitute. And all that's going into my batch, and I'm just gonna mix it up. You may need to add a little bit of extra flour just to get it off to a little bit more of a dough texture. This is a little bit wet for my liking today. It is fairly hot today, so that butter is melting and it's making it not really stay solid. And I am not liking how wet this texture is, so I'm gonna go ahead and throw this in the refrigerator for about a 1/2 hour and firm it up. It's looking like I have a bit of time to kill while I'm waiting for that cracker to. So I am going to make a batch of my absolute favorite Victorian butter biscuit, and I feel like I cannot complete this room without doing so. This recipe came out of Mrs. Beaton's household management book. This is just a reference guide that if you were a Victorian woman, you would have had this reference guide to teach you all about how to set up your kitchen, your home, how to entertain, and all kinds of crazy things. Today is the first time I am going to attempt to do this sugar-free and completely vegan, so this could be a crash and burn, but we're gonna try it out and see. So I have a 1/4 cup of butter, I have a 1/2 cup of pastry flour, 2 tablespoons of brown sugar sub version of Lakanto. This is a very small batch because it is a test. Cream together the sugar and butter first. I do notice that this vegan butter melts much quicker than a regular butter does. I mean, I know I'm battling a hot day here, but it does melt a lot quicker. So just gonna sprinkle a bit of flour on my board here. I love using my pastry dough cutter. I'm just gonna use this for my shaping. This is very similar to a Scottish biscuit Victorian. This is just the Victorian version of it. I'm gonna get these off into the oven. All right, I'm back to it with the crackers, and I'm just gonna flour this board. The dough is still a bit on the wet side. I might not be able to use my cutter here. It's so wet. All right, you know what? We need to remix this with some more flour. This is just way too wet. At this point, I've added about a cup of that rye flour because this, for some reason, is really wet today. So because of the amount of flour I have just had to add, I'm concerned about not having enough salt. So I'm gonna go ahead and dump in an extra 1/4 teaspoon of salt. You want your dough to kind of be almost like that Victorian biscuit dough. So I just continue to add rye flour till I got to that point. I do want a thin cracker. Go ahead and see it's rolling out nicely. It's about 3/16 of an inch, somewhere between 1/4 and 1/8 of an inch. I found these little hexagon presses, and if I press this whole thing in here, I should get a whole bunch of little hexagon crackers. In theory, we shall see. Oh, awesomeness. They are a bit tiny, but it's all right. I will poke them with a fork the same way I did with the biscuits, and these are gonna go into the oven at 325 for about 12 to 15 minutes. The Victorian biscuits went in at 325 for 15 minutes. Okay, so this Victorian butter biscuit. Now, the biscuit itself is okay. It is not the best thing ever I've had. It is not by any means even close to what my normal Victorian butter biscuit would be. It has nothing at all to do with the butter. There's something funky with that Lakanto replacement for brown sugar. I'd much rather have a vegan cookie than a sugar-free cookie. If you don't eat brown sugar in your life, then you probably wouldn't even notice it. But for me, I can totally tell. I totally would have no problem subbing the butter, but I would just go with the regular brown sugar. All right. Here we go with the cheeses. Now I have tasted all of these cheeses on their own, and then I have paired them here with both a savory and a sweet, and just to see how they are gonna work. Dill cheese I have paired with the stone fruit preserves. The wine cheese I have paired with the strawberry jam, and then the goat cheese-like cheese I also paired with the stone fruit. And I have cut up some cucumbers for the savory. Here we go. Go in for the goat cheese. Onion is really strong in it. I don't feel like it is a goat cheese substitute. Maybe adding a little bit of the nutritional yeast to it, or it could just have needed a longer fermentation process. It's not a bad cheese. I enjoy it. It pairs really well with the apricot jam. I think it needs the apricot jam. It can't really stand alone without some kind of sweetness to offset the onion flavor that's in it. The wine cheese. Overall, it's really potent in that wine. I probably could have dialed it back a little bit. It could use a tiny bit more sweetness. I did pick up a maple syrup, and I had hoped that using a pecan would also give it that sweetness. It's there, it just, I think it needs just a slightly bit more sweetness to it. It pairs really well with that jam. So as a standalone cheese, it would need to have more maple syrup added to it. But if you're gonna pair it with a jam, it's totally fine. It is very strong in a wine flavor, but it's a good cheese. And now, I know this is already my favorite cheese. As a standalone, hands down, it is the best cheese on this board, but I am totally biased because dill cheese is my favorite. It's a really good cheese. It doesn't need anything added onto it. The jam adds a little bit of something. If you like the pairing of the savory and sweet together, I could do without it because I just love the cheese for what it is on its own. There you have it. I am going to be packing up all of this stuff and heading over to the full installation so we can take a walkthrough. And that walkthrough will happen next week so you can see the completion of this month's endeavor project that I have taken on. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like, share, and subscribe if you have not done so already, and I hope to see you soon.